Welcome to A New Capitalism, the podcast that will show you how you can invest your money to help create a more just and prosperous economy for all. Here's Frank Altman.
My guest today is Roy Swan, the inaugural head of Ford Foundation's Mission Investments Program, deploying endowment capital for impact investments and providing investment and grant capital to support a global ESG ecosystem. His team covers the U.S., Africa, China, India, Indonesia, Latin America, and the Middle East. With a background spanning finance, banking, investments, and law, Roy has served on numerous corporate and nonprofit boards over the past 3 decades. Roy, good to see you again, and welcome to the podcast.
Great seeing you, and thanks for having me.
I'm going to start with a question, tell me a little bit about how you came to be managing Ford Foundation's mission investment portfolio.
Yeah, well, it came as a big surprise to me, to be honest. I was very happily entrenched at Morgan Stanley. I certainly saw the announcement when the Ford Foundation was covered on the first business page of the New York Times back in April 2017, and was just so thrilled to see the announcement that I literally printed out copies and walked around the floor of my office there at Morgan Stanley, just telling everyone that Darren Walker has once again moved the earth. And then a couple months later, 6 weeks or I get a call from an executive search firm, and it's about the new position. And I said, oh, it's such an exciting announcement, and it's so great, and I hope they get the right person. And the search firm said, well, what about you? I'm like, oh, are you kidding me? Why would I ever leave Morgan Stanley? Long and short of it is, after several calls and from the executive search firm and a few of my mentors, I decided to become a candidate for the role. But this is where things transitioned from me allowing myself to become a candidate to feeling like I had to have the job. The day after I told the search firm that I'd be willing to be a candidate, that was a Friday. Saturday morning, I was in my office, and it was around 9 o'clock, and I got an email from Darren Walker. And I'm like, wow, I haven't been in touch with Darren Walker. I hadn't seen him in years. It's really nice, president of Ford Foundation. And the email said something to the effect of, I hear you've entered the process as a candidate. I've been following your career, and you've done some really impressive things, and we're so happy that you're going to be a candidate. And I saw that type of personal touch, and it really was meaningful for me. And here I am, and it's been 6 years. Time has flown by.
Before we jump into some details, my new book, A New Capitalism, seeks to address the inequities in capitalism and advocates ways investors can help create a just economy that works for all. In that vein, how does the Ford Foundation seek more inclusive investments?
I think your book title there hits the nail on the head. And the reason why this program was created at the Ford Foundation was an acknowledgement and engagement in answering the question, for a charitable foundation, why do we limit our allocation of our resources to just 5% of our resources? What about the other 95%? The term mission-related investments is a technical term under the IRS, which is our primary regulator. And what it means is the use of endowment capital invested in a way that is aligned with a foundation's charitable mission, hence mission-related investments. And it's a safe harbor that protects the fiduciary integrity of the trustees of the foundation and the staff who are seeking to use the capital to affect positive impact, social, environmental, and so forth. And so that's what the Ford Foundation has created. We are a unique animal within the foundation world. So unlike most foundation programs are grant programs, the program that I have been entrusted to run is essentially a foundation within the Ford Foundation. That is, we have every capital tool of a foundation. That's grants, recoverable grants, program-related investments, and endowment capital, mission-related investments. We have all those tools within our group because the feeling is that we need all the capital tools available so that we can take a 360-degree approach to bringing about systems change of the type that your book title suggests.
So could you tell us the difference between a mission investment and a program-related investment? I know these are kind of technical terms in the foundation world, but I think our listeners would like to understand the difference.
Yeah. A program-related investment is the term, it's again a technical term that was invented by the Ford Foundation, the Taconic Foundation, and the IRS back in 1968. And the term was created to define the use of grant capital allocated in the form of investment capital. So it's essentially grant capital, so not from the corpus, it's grant capital that is invested in the form of debt and equity. And the whole point of PRIs was to create a way for capital to come back, grant capital to come back to a foundation. In the past, grant capital was a negative 100% return. Once given, it was gone. The program-related investment was a way to help foundations advance their missions, but also have the opportunity to recycle their capital, which could make them that much more effective. So the Ford Foundation was at the front line of creating that vehicle. Mission-related investments is different. So foundations and their endowments are regulated under state and federal regulatory authorities. And within the fiduciary obligations of a foundation, certain types of behavior is expected, such that the trustees and investment staff are prudent stewards of the endowments whose beneficiaries are members of society. And the term mission-related investment was created to describe the type of investment that it could look like it is higher risk than what might be prudently accepted. That's a very narrow view, but the point is that the federal regulators wanted to make clear that it is possible and desirable to try to do well and do good. And they wanted to say that doing well and doing good is a protected objective within the investment world. Europe, there are outside the US, it's business as usual and a view of common sense that if there are opportunities to invest capital in ways that do well and do good, meaning generating appropriate risk-adjusted market rates of return, that should be fine. In the U.S., there have been false narratives conveyed that would lead people to believe that if you're trying to do something good, you can't possibly make money. And what the Ford Foundation Board of Trustees decided to do was to follow other foundations. I mean, Clara Miller at F.B. Heron is the real maverick in this area. And the Ford Foundation said, well, let's see if that can happen here. And that's how the $1 billion commitment to endowment capital was allocated over time. And that's what I was asked to oversee along with PRIs and grants. Those are the differences.
And I would say at CRF, the use of program-related investments was very vital to our success in scaling because foundations like the Ford Foundation and others were willing to take a higher risk for the return that they would be receiving. And that's consistent with how the IRS defines one of the criteria of a program-related investment is that it is a below-market investment. However, mission investing, as I understand it, is aimed at a risk-adjusted rate of return, as you indicated, that also generates a social impact. And what's been happening particularly in the last several months or so, has been a pushback against the concept of environmental, social, or governance or other factors being a part of an investment decision. So could you talk a little bit about how Ford is sort of negotiating the issues in the United States around ESG investing?
Yeah. So ESG is a term that was coined to describe a disclosure framework. It was a way to categorize areas that companies could provide non-accounting figures, we'll say non-GAAP accounting figures. I'm not going to use the term non-financial because I think that's inaccurate. So non-GAAP accounting disclosures that could help investors with their risk management duties. And the term has been twisted a bit by opportunists who understandably felt attacked. And so what I mean specifically is people from the fossil fuels industry, as an example, felt ESG was an attack on their wealth, their livelihoods, jobs, et cetera. And to me, it's perfectly understandable because what happened with ESG is it evolved from a risk management framework into a product that involved ratings, subjective ratings by name the rating agency. What ended up happening was if you're in the fossil fuel industry, you got a low rating. So I think it stands to reason that someone who depends on their job in the fossil fuel industry to put food on the table for their families, it stands to reason that they would feel attacked. The problem is that those ratings are subjective and it doesn't take into account everything that's involved. And there's also been an absence, until recently, there's been an absence of the additional narrative around fossil fuels industry. I'm using this as an example because it's the one that's been most prominent, I think. But there's been a lot of attacks on the fossil fuel industry, but until recently, there hadn't been enough discussion around the supports that would be necessary to help us move away from a fuel source or a power source that's actually hurting the planet. But on the other hand, if we turn it off, many of us would suffer. So for us, we focused on creating a narrative and a set of objectives that focus on the positive results that are possible when we look at investing and we look at systems change, and we use a term called patriotic capitalism. That's a term that I developed. It may have been used before, but I've been using it because terms like ESG and DEI and woke, well, certainly with DEI and woke, those terms were associated with Black people, just to cut to the chase. People have different reactions to things that are associated with Black people than they have with terms like patriotic and capitalism. Those are two revered terms that were already imbued with such positive feelings over hundreds of years that I thought it appropriately described what we're trying to accomplish at the Ford Foundation, which is to find big social problems, invest our capital so that we can try to address the problems, maybe solve the problems, and serve as a guide for others who also want to do well and do good. So we've never considered ourselves to be ESG investors. I've never really considered that to be a legitimate term just because it's convoluted. I know I spend a lot of time being both technical and using layperson language, but we are impact investors. We are allocating our capital to address big social problems where we believe we can fix the problems and make money, risk-adjusted market rate returns at a minimum. And we believe that there are some areas where we can generate what's referred to as alpha. And that's the reason why we believe we can generate alpha is because we believe we have a deep understanding of the arbitrage opportunity between perceived risk and actual risk.
Sounds like a true investor. So let's move to the big problems that the Ford Foundation is seeking to address. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your priorities and strategies.
No, I'd love to. So one of the major areas of focus is an impact investing theme we refer to as quality jobs. It's also known as the good job strategy, which is the term coined by Professor Zeynep Tun at MIT Sloan School. Professor Tun is an operations research expert, PhD from Harvard Business School, and she's written a couple books on this notion. And to summarize the notion, actually, before I get to the notion, let me say, what's the big problem? The big problem is, I'll describe it in the context of a turn of events. So after sort of going into and after World War II, there was a really great trilateral agreement, so to speak, between government, business, and labor. It was at a time when shared prosperity through American capitalism flourished. That was because of the cooperation among those three partners. And in fact, J&J's credo really laid it out beautifully, where it said that as long as we take care of our employees, our customers, and our communities, the shareholders will do just fine. What happened beginning sort of in the 70s, and a lot of people look at the flag waving of the start of this attack on shared prosperity in America, was the famous New York Times article, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Maximize Shareholder Returns." That was written by Milton Friedman, and it was an article that caught a lot of imaginations of certain types of capitalists. And that resulted in the life of the worker deteriorating. It wasn't just Friedman's doctrine, it was also some of the offshoring erosion of labor unions that made collective bargaining deteriorate. And so the long and short of it is, the top 1% had enormous wage and income growth, and the bottom 90%, which is most of us, faced deteriorating wages and wealth. So we're addressing what is today among the most severe wealth and inequality gaps in American history. And the goal is, and this is where I get to the notion I'll summarize, the good job strategy or the quality job strategy says superior operational design and superior human capital investment can deliver superior financial returns. We truly believe that, and there's plenty of evidence available. I'll give you a simple example. The research indicates that 70 to 80% of all workers in the world are disengaged. And that research also estimates that costs globally roughly $8 trillion in profits, not revenues, profits. And in the U.S. alone, it's $550 billion estimated. What we know is that engaged employees drive innovation, they're more productive, and therefore the companies for which they work are more profitable. So if you invest in human capital, it enables you to execute the most effective and efficient operational designs. You can't execute the best operational design when you have some workers who are actually sabotaging your company. So our goal is to try to get private equity particularly, and also corporations, to start treating workers, their employees, as the valuable human capital assets they are, as opposed to fungible expenses. And that's difficult in a world where the private equity playbook, the buyout playbook, has been buy company, fire as many workers as possible, cut wages, benefits, et cetera, increase net income, sell at a higher valuation so you can collect a nice carried interest, rinse and repeat. It's a very difficult challenge, but there's great upside both for business and the American economy. Second area I'll focus on, we have 6 total, is diverse fund managers. There's a statistic that has become pretty well known over the last couple of years. It was put out by Harvard Business School research funded by the Knight Foundation. Of the 80 plus trillion in assets under management in the U.S., 98.6% of that is controlled by white men. 1.4% is controlled by women and people of color. Women and people of color make up 70% of the U.S. population, and they control 1.4% of investment capital. In a capitalist system, if you don't have access to capital, what you have is a big problem. And in my belief, this is not a Ford Foundation, in my belief, every social problem in the Black community particularly is caused by that lack of access to capital. It was by design because among the most important legal regimes in American history was to forbid Black people from owning assets. In fact, Black people were assets. They weren't humans. They were property. I started with Black people partly because I'm Black and also because Black people are at the bottom of the economic pyramid in the U.S. based on Fed statistics and I think based on common knowledge and observation. So one of the things that we know is that maintaining the race-based barriers to opportunity has cost the U.S. economy $50 trillion since 1990 alone. That is not good for America. So one of the things that we try to do is we try to help people understand when you provide more access to capital, for example, to Black people, to women, including white women, other people of color, you're not just helping Black people, you're helping America, because that 50 trillion is dead weight loss that has cost us our global authority, our global economic position. The other thing we know is if we dropped race-based barriers for Black people, within a few short years, 5 trillion in additional GDP would be unleashed. So again, that fits with patriotic capitalism. It's capitalism that takes into consideration our country, our democracy, and the common good, so that when we have a more inclusive economy, we are all better off. We raise our global standing. We advance our national security interest. We create greater prosperity for all.
And Roy, I would just add that children born in this decade are primarily children of color, who will be in the workforce and everywhere in the next 20 to 40 years. Makes the current 1% representation of people of color and women managing money untenable. As demographic shifts, businesses that fail to recognize and adapt to this changing mainstream will struggle to find employees and customers. Okay, Roy, we have to stop here, but coming up on the next episode of A New Capitalism, Roy Swan, who leads mission investments at the Ford Foundation, will discuss the organization's emphasis on inclusive capitalism practices.
While we do sometimes make investments in businesses where we know we're going to lose a lot of money, our primary focus is this notion of inclusive capitalism, where people who have been intentionally excluded, we believe by providing them the capital that they haven't had access to, they can produce commercial activity. That's how we've been focusing more recently.
This has been A New Capitalism with Frank Altman. If you'd like to connect with Frank and join the movement to create a new capitalism that works for all, go to frankaltman.com. Frank's book is available on print, audio, and ebook formats on all major book-selling sites. A New Capitalism is a production of Forbes Books.